Okay, here we are at Yambuck Lake Caravan Park, which will be our base for the next couple of days as we visit several locations in the area associated with the paternal side of my family tree. Today our first stop is a small town called Woolsthorpe, located about 25k north of Warrnambool, where my great-great-grandfather Robert Mills lived and worked as a stockman on an adjacent pastoral run. While Robert died tragically at the age of 36, his story is totally intriguing and something I'm sure you'll find totally interesting. So here we are in Woolsthorpe, where in the years leading up to my great-great-grandfather's death, he worked as a stockman on a nearby pastoral run called Kilmorey Station. He holds a special place in the history of this town, as he is the only person recorded as paying rates on a dwelling in Woolsthorpe back in 1854, which makes him arguably the first resident in this town. According to my research, Robert first came to live in Woolsthorpe soon after he married Sarah Shepherd in Adelaide, South Australia, around 1849. Passenger lists show a Sarah Shepherd, aged 18, arriving in Adelaide, South Australia from Middleton, England, with an Emma Shepherd, aged 22, possibly her cousin. We next find Sarah and Robert living in Woolsthorpe, where they go on to have 7 children, the second youngest being my great-grandfather Charles, or Chas Mills. Tragically, in August 1857, Sarah died from a hemorrhage one day after giving birth to her 8th child, Edmund Mills, and Sarah is buried in this cemetery here at Woolsthorpe in an unmarked grave. 2 years later, Robert marries Isabella McRae, with whom he has another child, Bessie Mills, in 1859. The ceremony is carried out by a travelling Wesleyan minister at Kilmorey Station. Nothing is recorded against Robert and Isabella until the 25th of September 1864, when Robert's first child with Sarah, Alfred Mills, goes missing while fishing alone on the Merry River. The boat he was found fishing in is later found floating downriver, and he is presumed drowned. The day after, his father, Robert Mills, kills himself with strychnine. At the inquest into his death, his wife tells of a man who returns from drinking 2 or 3 days at the public house at Winslow, racked with depression and grief, and who, black in the face and frothing at the mouth, is reported as saying on his deathbed he was sorry for what he had done and prayed for mercy and forgiveness. Robert is buried next to his wife at this cemetery in an unmarked grave. His death certificate shows he was 38 years old. Sadly, Alfred's body wasn't found until about 10 days after Robert died, washed up in the reeds of the Merry River. Tied around his wrist was a broken cord he'd been using to fish for eels, which most likely snagged and caused him to fall into the river and drown. Apart from grieving over the loss of his son, exactly why Robert was so repentant at the time to take his own life is unclear, but some clues may be found in what happened next. According to Robert's death records, he was born in Liverpool, England, in or around the year 1826, and had spent the last 36 and a half years in the colonies, time in each unknown. This would mean Robert was only 1.5 years old when he arrived in Australia, presumably with his father John, who was recorded as being a sailor. But how much of this can we believe? Interestingly, about 8 years later, in the year 1872, appeared a mysterious article in the Warrnambool Advertiser titled "Sir Roger Tichborne Dead and Buried." The article talks about a Robert Mills, a man of dissolute habits who associated with the lowest people yet in his sober moments showed he had moved in a different sphere, could speak fluent French, was a good singer and a capital horseman. It's not clear where the author got this information, but it could have come from Robert's second wife, Isabella, who was working as a servant in Warrnambool at the time. The rather long article goes on to suggest that one day after his second marriage, as he was going away from his home, as was his custom periodically, he told his wife if anyone called and asked for Tom Castro, to say that she didn't know who this person was. Again, he said he had been wrecked in the Bella, coming from Valparaiso, and was only 3 days on an island without food, and was saved by tying a red shirt on an oar, as a consequence of which he always wore a red shirt. On another occasion, he told his wife he had married her under an assumed name. Once he casually mentioned his acquaintance of Lord Bellow. This Bob Mills also had the emblems of faith, hope and charity tattooed on his arm, and the initials RTC. The article suggests that Robert Mills was not who he said, but was the missing Sir Roger Tichborne, a young English aristocrat who was heir to the Tichborne fortune and who allegedly living under an assumed name in the Australian colonies. As it turns out, in 1864, a chap from Wagga Wagga, Australia, later identified as Tom Castro, had already claimed to be the missing lord and was embroiled in what would become the biggest trial in English history up until that point in time. Even though Sir Roger Tichborne would have been about the same age as my great-great-grandfather, extensive research has failed to reveal any evidence supporting this suggestion, except maybe that Robert indeed changed his name before his first marriage to Sarah Shepherd. Most damning is the fact that at the time Sir Roger Tichborne went missing in a ship off the coast of South America in 1853, my great-great-grandfather was already married to his first wife, Sarah Shepherd, and they already had 2 or 3 children. Nonetheless, this article does raise some interesting questions about Robert's family background. In these early days, many men and women who had served sentences as convicts lived under assumed names. Maybe this was the case with Robert Mills, a situation that supports why to date extensive research has failed to identify any DNA links with the surname Mills. So what was it like living in a place like Woolsthorpe for Robert Mills and his family? Maybe our next stop might go somewhere towards answering this question. Here we are at Lake Cartcarong, just 6 kilometres down the road from Woolsthorpe towards Warrnambool. It's here where the Mills children hunted for wildfowl and goose eggs, much to the displeasure of the local Aboriginals. We know this from an obituary published on the death of Robert Mills's third-born son, James, in 1939. He was 86 years old. Let me quote a couple of paragraphs from the article. One of the oldest Australian-born natives, Mr. James Mills, died at Koroit on Tuesday at the age of 86. He was a native of Winslow, where we are now, and lived in the district all his life. Blacks were numerous when he was a boy, and he had many encounters with dingoes in what is now known as the Wickham Scrub. As a young man, James went on to become a jockey and then a stock driver before taking up carting supplies to the Ballarat goldfield diggings. In 1878, he married the daughter of a wealthy landowner, Rosina Thwaites, after which he settled to a life of farming and dairying on a property just north of Koroit. Next stop, we're going to stop at the Southern Cross, which is just a few kilometres northwest of Warrnambool, where James Mills and his wife Rosina farmed and raised a family of 7 children. So here we are standing outside the recently restored Southern Cross Hotel, which is all that remains of the small township these days. I also just happened to learn when talking to the gentleman who now lives in the pub that just over the road stood a small store where one of Australia's most famous authors, Frank Hardy, was born and raised in the early 1900s. He's best known for his 1950 novel Power Without Glory and for later political activism. I've also stopped here to briefly relay another sad story of suicide of yet another Robert Mills, in this case the son of James and Rosina, whose farm was located just down the road from here. I don't mean to dwell on the tragic parts of my family's history, but unfortunately, when researching the lives of family members who lived an almost nondescript life over 150 years ago, in a time before computers, motor cars and photography, and when a lot of people were illiterate, the only records available in the public domain are those relating to births, christenings, and in this case, deaths, especially for those who died under unusual circumstances. As was the case with this Robert Mills, who at the age of 42 years went missing from his home and was found 2 days later lying in the scrub on the road to Woolsthorpe with his throat cut, his razor still in his hand. The inquest into Robert's death records that prior to him going missing, he had been, quote, depressed of late, a condition for which there was little medical attention in those days. On this rather sad note, we're heading back to our base at Lake Yambuck, travelling through the town of Koroit along the way. Tomorrow we're off to Warrnambool to continue our journey into the paternal side of my family tree, and there are plenty more interesting stories to tell about ex-convicts and, sadly, the horrific murder of a young relative that shocked the nation. But more about that tomorrow.